Good evening, fellow students. I'm going to be refuting the claim about the death penalty is ineffective. The advocate's three secondary claims were: 1, the death penalty is racially biased; 2, the death penalty is expensive; and 3, the death penalty risks the execution of the innocent. And my response to the main claim is, despite these supporting claims and the evidence based on these claims, the death penalty is an effective form of capital punishment against the guilty. My response to the first secondary claim which is the death penalty is racially biased, is I noticed a quote from the advocate that states from the American Civil Liberties in 2000 that people of color comprise 43% of total executions since 1976. And a quote, a statement I got from the Clark County Attorney Office, explains that since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, 1,246 convicted murderers have been executed in the United States. Of those executed, 704, or 57%, were whites, and 424, or 34%, were black, by the Clark County Attorney Office. The reasoning challenge I bring up is a statement made also from the advocates explaining that they state that some people are still guided by conscious or unconscious racial bias. I believe the they parts came from a couple of doctors from an article that the advocate researched on. However, what brought up my question is how are they still guided? What internal or internal factors affect people's judgment on the death penalty? How are they biased? Why are they biased? It's usually mostly on personal preference and beliefs. And a counterclaim I have thought of myself, and I got a quote from Roger Clegg from procon.org, is, the fact that blacks and Hispanics are charged with capital crimes out of proportion to their numbers in the general population may simply mean that blacks and Hispanics commit capital crimes out of proportion to their numbers. Capital criminals don't look like America. No one is surprised to find more men than women in this class, nor is it a shock to find that this group contains more 20-year-olds, by Roger Clegg. My response to the secondary claim which is the death penalty is expensive, is one statement made that explains that an execution is worth double than an average life sentence. And from this, I can conclude that every state varies with cost of the death penalty depending on taxes and how long the case can go on. And in the advocate's statement or speech, he takes a couple of prices from North Carolina and I believe Texas, stating that a North Carolina death penalty case costs an additional $11 million to $20 million a year. I have no resources on that fact. And a quote done by Dudley Sharp from procon.org states that we must choose either the death penalty, which is roughly about $2 million per case, depending on the state, or life without parole, or LWOP, which can be $1 million for 50 years. The JFA, Justice for All, estimates that life without parole cases will cost $1.2 million to $3.6 million more than equivalent death penalty cases. And another statement brought up by the advocate explains that in the article, Just or Not, Cost of Death Penalty Killer is a Killer for State Budgets by Ed Barnes, states that every time a killer is sentenced to die, a school closes. As I researched this article on foxnews.com, there is no backup data or sources to prove that each death penalty shuts a school down. I'm assuming it's a hypothetical case due to perhaps budget cuts in the state or debt or pensions from that state causing the school to shut down. A counterclaim I would like to bring up is that taxes from the death penalty are not the only killers for individual budgets that could possibly crush individuals. I went onto the Census Bureau site and I found that California income taxes are roughly $54 million, And the United States total income taxes is roughly $274 million. And I took the liberty of looking up North Carolina's too, and to compare it to the death penalty case, and that's roughly $10 million. And while the death penalty can have an impact on the state's budget, there are other taxes that overpower the death penalty's money grip. And my response to the third secondary claim is that the death penalty risks the execution of the innocent. For the evidence, I challenge that in the past 2 years, the Chicago Tribune, the Houston Chronicle, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch all reported that since 1976, 4 of the 116 executed were most likely innocent. And during the speech, the advocate didn't specify these 4 cases. It did not explain why these 4 inmates were sentenced to death, even though they could have been proven innocent. And the reasoning challenge I bring up is that even though when the state sentences inmates for the death penalty, and it can be a hefty charge, the death penalty is necessary for some cases. It may not deter crime, but it can stop some very highly wanted criminals from roaming the streets ever again, even if they still don't get life without parole. And by human error, an innocent person can be wrongfully executed and nobody can prevent that. And until other forms of punishment are proven to deter crime and cost less than the death penalty other than life without parole, the death penalty is the chosen alternative to stop certain highly wanted criminals. In conclusion, I respond that saying that the death penalty is not racially biased. The death penalty is expensive. However, it is the only form of true punishment, true capital punishment that will stop certain crimes, and that even though the death penalty risks the execution of the innocent, is the only proven way to end certain criminals. Thank you.
All right, well, you follow the structure pretty clearly, but sometimes the analysis of the arguments gets a little convoluted. On the last point, for instance, you've got a discussion of, you've got a couple of questions about whether or not people were in fact guilty, and they're reasonable questions to ask. And then you get involved in this discussion about whether or not, what the costs are relative to this point, and I'm not sure how the cost issue ends up applying to the issue of people who are innocent being executed. It just seems like you are kind of automatically trying to give a response on some of the points without necessarily thinking about how important that response is. There were a couple of good presses, 1 or 2 good pieces of information. The stuff on the racial bias, for instance, I thought was a pretty good start. The cost issue, you had a couple of good statistics on this. There's one place where you're talking about the impact, and you're talking about the state income taxes and the federal income taxes, and you're doing comparisons. I do think you hurt your credibility a little bit, because I'm pretty sure that you have billions, and it should be billions, and you said millions. So you just want to be consistent and double check that, because U.S. income tax being only $254 million, geez, that means that the whole income tax that we collect is less than some lotto game that was won last week. I know that that's not correct. All right? All right. Well, thank you all for your patience here.